Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. And this week, I'm going to continue on with this theme on relationships, and I want to talk about projecting and splitting, and the way in which we split things off as a way to cope and manage feelings of being overwhelmed, and how we project things that we are overwhelmed by onto others. And that this is a way to manage stress and cope with that which is too much to bear. And this can be profoundly helpful because it means we can find ways to move forward even in circumstances that would shut us down and do shut us down. However, with these modalities, we can call them, splitting and projecting, what we're doing is we are finding a way to cope, but in the same breath, we are doing so at the expense of a part of ourselves. And so, just as the term splitting and projecting mean, just as if we think we split a piece of one thing away from another, or we project something away from something, there is a separation that is implicit in this process. And so if we think about what's going on, we might speak in terms of myself and yourself, or whatever it is that we define as a quote-unquote self. And I'd like to start this discussion about splitting and projecting from the perspective that there is actually no self, that what we're talking about when we are talking about a so-called self is a construct, an idea that exists in relation to others, and that it operates in a way that we see as being continuous. So we recognize ourselves when we're at one age, and then we have a birthday, and so on and so forth. And all of these changes are, by and large, changes that occur within this changing self, what we call a self. And it establishes a kind of continuity. Now, what this continuity does is it stabilizes what we see as being who we are, right? I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a certain age, I have a certain set of beliefs, I have a certain expectation of things, I might feel a certain sense of entitlement, and all of these different things operate as a kind of organizational set of parameters that place us within this world, right? So in the existential sense, we are beings in a world, in relation, and so on, and that this being dynamic, this ontological aspect of our identity, is understood through the lens of existing, which is a dynamic that is changing yet recognizable as a thing, and that recognizable thing we're calling a self. But what happens when things emerge within ourself that we do not feel are us, that we do not recognize, or we are not willing to recognize? This is where we get into splitting and projecting. And it's in this shift. It is this shift from I need to get things out of this orbit I have of, let's call it my Jordanness or my selfness, and so I need to push that out onto somebody else. Now, as I said earlier, the self is entirely a construct. So what we're talking about is not the person in an autonomous way. We're talking about the person in a contingent way, which means we are all in relation to one another. So let me try and give an example that might solidify this in a way. When a person exhibits contempt towards somebody else, a certain kind of phobia about sexuality, race, religion, and so on, there is in that act an othering where the person is saying, I am not that which I am saying is wrong. and they are making this claim that they are not whatever it is, of a certain status, of a certain sexual preference, of a certain sexual identity. Whatever it is, they're saying, I am not that. And so in this self that has been constructed, they are making clear to the world that they are not certain things. Now, strictly speaking, this is just not relevant, right? If you think of it in terms of a parsimonious kind of Occam's razor kind of thing, where this doesn't really serve any function in terms of human relationships and the quickest path, and even just on a baseline level of efficiency, it doesn't really make sense to other people in this way. For example, why not have allies? Why not have connections? Why not create an environment that's safe? Why would we create an environment that's inherently dangerous by othering people and then creating conflict and from that danger? Well, this is where we get into this idea of the constructed self as something that is then fixed on a very narrow idea, and that is learned. So if I saw this video of young kids, and they're all, my guess is 5 and 3, 4, 5 kind of thing. And these were kids of different genders and different races, and they're sitting beside each other or standing beside each other, and they're asked, what makes you different? And the kids didn't describe gender and they didn't describe race. They described like one liked mushrooms, one didn't, or one liked, a certain, typically things like food or certain, like a favorite color or things like that. The things that made them different, in other words, were based upon the constructive self that they were working within, that orbit of self. And for the kids, that included things like certain foods, certain colors, short hair, long hair, liking a baseball cap, not like, any of these kinds of things. Now, what's interesting about that example is it points out how completely irrelevant these things are. They are just as irrelevant as race and religion and so on, in the sense that they are ways in which we orient ourselves, but we could orient ourselves in any number of ways, because the fundamental to creating a self and having a self is simply that we operate within a world, within our beingness. And from that perspective, we can do any number of things. So going back to this idea of where is this implicit response to other somebody, and to do so with such a violent and aggressive trajectory, it's like we need to convince others that we are not that thing. So, as an aside, if somebody expresses their contempt towards, say, a homosexual, I just assume they are homosexual themselves or have had thoughts about homosexuality. And I assume this not to be cheeky. I assume this because it's something that's on their mind, and they seem to be struggling with reconciling how their sexuality is, what their sexuality is, and what that may mean. And so they're pointing out to the world that they are not something. This is coming up a lot in terms of laws about gender and trying to limit individuals in various different ways, where we're seeing this form of splitting and projecting that is trying to present an idea of whatever they say is the normal versus the unnormal. Now, this is a highly contingent, or you could say unstable self. And this is where splitting and projecting start to reflect a lack of stability, which I think is pretty clear when we look at the world, that there isn't this real continuity. I'm not suggesting that there was before, but I'm just talking about right now, the idea of political continuity, religious continuity, social continuity, gender continuity, race continuity, all of these things. I don't think anybody would say, there's this one area, there's a couple little things, but by and large, everything's fine. The population of people on Earth, we're not convinced the world is round, right? There are fundamental constructs of identity that operate in a split off and divided way that has a function that goes beyond simply saying that something is good or bad or right or wrong. There's clearly something underneath this. And so what is it that propels us to split things off? Well, when I think about the experience of splitting something off myself or projecting something onto somebody that is intolerable to me, I am operating as if I'm being watched. There's a kind of implicit guilt in this experience where I don't want to be caught thinking certain things, saying certain things, being around certain people, being aligned with certain beliefs and so on. I am so existentially overwhelmed by that idea. And I feel implicitly this form of vulnerability that actually triggers within myself an autonomic response that is like a danger state of some kind. That by aligning myself with others or crossing that split or embracing that projection, I am in some way in danger. The implicit felt response is that of danger. And this creates a very paradoxical form of operating because it is a non-rational process. We are in a triggered state and we are acting and splitting and projecting based upon a triggered state. However, we're doing it without the acknowledgement or the recognition that we are in fact operating implicitly, which is to say we are having this experience, this felt danger. I need to be a part of this group. I need to persecute that group, or I need to cut this person out and include this person. And this is felt in a very dramatic, emphatic, all-encompassing, very emotional way, very righteous way. There's a great deal of certainty to these beliefs that one is affected in such a way that to step away from that would be would be perilous. So as an example, you can imagine somebody saying, if I'm not heard by my partner and if they don't really understand me, then I'm alone. Similarly, if we think about a relationship where somebody is pursuing and really trying to be heard and the other person just shuts down, well, the person shutting down is not feeling heard, the person pursuing and engaging is not feeling heard. So what's the model that's happening here? What's the projection and what's the splitting? Well, interestingly and tragically in some instances, what it is the person who's pursuing is seeking that which they have not experienced themselves. There is this feeling that they are not full or whole or safe or complete. I don't mean full or whole in the sense of like living a fulfilled life. I mean in the sense of feeling nurtured, feeling almost like you're in a womb, that you're safe, you're contained, everything is okay. Similarly, for the person who's withdrawing, they are more clearly moving themselves into this state. What this means is these implicit responses to try and have some form of holistic, held experience, some safe space, a kind of womb, becomes the feeling that we want. And yet what is actually playing out is operating through the lens of what we're calling our needs in terms of our self-needs. But really what we're talking about in this context is not an ideological need. We're talking about the fundamental human need to be heard and to be valued, to not become the object of someone else's projections, and not to in turn displace that form of emotional disparity upon others through splitting. So if we look at this and kind of parse it apart a little bit, Imagine a relationship where there are two people, they've been together for, let's say, 10 years. And over the course of that relationship, they have developed certain habits and certain patterns. And they are managing. They call themselves happy. They say that they're basically content. But it's, to whatever extent, kind of a routine. And yet they keep on going. Then something happens. Somebody becomes ill. Somebody loses a job. Both. The circumstances that they are now in are triggering forms of anxiety that are existential. So the illness is now raising questions of life and death. The loss of job is raising questions about meaning and purpose. They're both raising questions about alienation and isolation. There is this shift in how their self is oriented. And like I was saying earlier in the podcast, that self is really just creating a kind of tunnel of continuity, but it doesn't actually exist. And so now what happens is this couple is facing, a job loss situation, an illness situation. And the question is how do they face that? Well, by projecting things onto one another, by splitting things off from themselves, they are trying to cope with this existential crisis, which is the splitting of self. Now, again, because the self doesn't actually exist, really what's being split is a concept. And so what I'd like to introduce as an analogy here is it's like we're working in one form of measuring, say with a ruler, and we need to switch to using measuring cups. And we're holding on to a former way of thinking. So what this means is we have a very specific way of looking at the world. And the idea of changing glasses, Wittgenstein has this line where he talks about we're wearing glasses and we don't realize we're wearing glasses. We're seeing the world in a certain way and we don't realize we're seeing the world in a certain way. And what that means is this idea of self is actually a lens through which we look. And when it no longer, or stops for whatever reason, being able to decipher these experiences because the experiences overwhelm this construct of self, we then project and split off. Now, this is a form of displacement. But again, the self is constructed. So the question is, when we are displacing, when we are splitting, what we are really doing is creating this idea of separation between us and these perilous events. However, there is no split. There is no separation between us and these perilous events. They are, that we're making it seem that way is more of a kind of psychological game we are playing with ourselves. And so in partnerships, what happens, or what can happen, is these psychological splits become the way in which a person escapes aspects of themselves. And when the couple tries to come together to talk about it, they see it as, well, we're just going to solve this problem. But the problem is not necessarily the issue. It's not the problem is not necessarily that somebody, isn't doing certain things around the house. These can be factors, of course, but the problem is much more fundamental than that. The problem is fundamentally this existential question of how do I deal with the fact that this thing called a self does not really exist? That the way I've oriented and understood myself to exist in the world, that this is actually something that is entirely an illusion. So I'll give another example, and this is from a TV show called Couples Therapy. And in one of the episodes is the COVID episode. I think it's at the end of season 1. There's a couple who both work in the entertainment industry. And for those of you, many of you know this, but for those of you who don't know, people in the entertainment industry were profoundly affected because, as you can imagine, it involves large crowds. And so it was for people working on Broadway and doing other musical theater or theater more broadly, the idea of people going to a theater was just off the table for quite a long time. So all of a sudden, actors and other people involved in that business were shut down, and it was really unclear when they would be going back to work. So both people worked in that sphere of the arts, right? Performing arts, and one was in film and the other was in theater. And they'd been together for a very, very long time. They'd met in high school, and so there was a question about, there was a kind of pressure on them to be together, that they were so perfect. It was almost as if people seemed to see them as the perfect couple, which then created an expectation on them. So that had its pressures, that this, a young couple who are then growing, and they are kind of a role model for other people, which is not what they had signed up for. Add to that, there was a great deal of distance in the relationship because they would both work separately often, or always pretty much. And then one partner had emotional affairs and then physical affairs. And the assumption was always that the problems in the relationship were that they were apart, right? That if they weren't apart, then there would be no affairs or emotional affairs because they would be together all the time. So I point this out because this can often be what happens when couples talk about, well, the point is he or she is not doing certain tasks around the house. These are factors, right? But what I want to get to is not just the task, but what the task means. And so in this example, we're seeing the couple, and they're in this session, and the woman is talking about how she's just not really attracted to her husband at this time, that he's just not working very much, he's not making very much or any money, that she just wants him to be, I don't think she used this word, but almost be stable and a protector and provide a kind of continuity. And that's what she needs. So she's essentially, in the language that I'm using in this podcast, is she's saying, this is how I understand myself to exist, and I need him to play that role so I can play this role, whatever that role is. And this hurts him, right? He was thinking that they would be spending more time together, that the fundamental issue that they were facing as a couple came about as a result of distance, and now they're locked down together, and he's finding out that that wasn't the fundamental issue, that there was something else going on here. And this is where we're going to get into the splitting piece. Then, a couple of sessions later, we see the same couple again. He's been really busy. He decided, that really struck him, hearing that she was thinking of him in this way. And that was really hard for him to hear, and it was painful. And he decided that he was going to work more and be busy and all the rest of it. And he subsequently was. Then something happened, and this is where splitting kind of comes to the fore. Then she wasn't as busy. She was feeling really vulnerable, and she was feeling really weak. So on the surface, you can think of it like the relationship, because remember, if a self doesn't exist, then two selves don't exist. So if the relationship has strength and weakness, the question is, where is it? How is it operating? How is it affecting the relationship? But it's moving around. That we say it's with one person, or that we lock it into one person, is no different than we lock any stereotype into a person based upon their gender or race. It's a form of simplification, or reduction, which is stereotyping. So if we say, he's weak, I'm strong, or she's weak, he's strong, what we're saying is they are now owners of this experience. And if we think about this couple, because space, in other words, they were always working and they were away from each other, it created the physical split just by the nature of their work. But the psychological split was actually the fundamental, which became apparent when they were actually sitting together in a lockdown situation, because it clearly was no longer that geography was doing that, i.e. one person was in one state, another person was in another state, because they were not only in the same state, they were in the same room, same apartment. So the psychological split was really what was going on, and that was occurring within the construct of the relationship through which this idea of a self, or himself, herself, was constructed. Geography essentially covered it up. What we see is that these projective identifications, meaning that she was moving her weakness out of herself onto him and saying she did not like that. She did not like it, and she was not going to be attracted to that. She's not going to put up with that. She's not going to tolerate that. Whatever it was that she was feeling, she was pushing that weakness away. But when he then said, okay, well, I'm going to get busy and do things, he effectively moved that out of his sphere, that he was no longer holding that. So something that had been split off that ended up in him, he then moved away from. She was then forced to feel that experience. Now, I want to be really, really clear. This is a couple dynamic. I'm not talking about one person's right, one person's wrong. That's not interesting to me in the slightest. What was really interesting to me, however, was the therapist encouraged them to do things that involved connection in ways that were intimate, but were not aligned with their past patterns of intimacy, meaning their relationship with sex was somewhat, you could almost say, archaic. They had a way of having sex or not having sex, and it, from what I could gather, it hadn't really changed. And so the therapist introduced the idea that holding and being intimate without having sex, without moving to sex, could create a sense of safety and security. Now, of course, that ultimately led to them having sex, but the point here is that we've gone from geographic separation to separation in the exact same apartment, and the answer was actually a kind of intimate connection that started to embrace the fact that there's weakness and that there's strength. Put another way, that there's vulnerability and that there's acceptance. And this really shifts from this idea of, strong, weak to vulnerable and accepting, where a person isn't giving anything up because, as I was saying earlier, there is no self per se. What is being experienced is the experience of other. Through acceptance and through vulnerability, we are now not having to split off where one person is weak, the other person is strong, and then they switch. We're now saying, we are embracing this weakness. We are embracing this vulnerability. We are creating strength. We are creating and exploring the unknown. We are engaging this together. So if we think about this idea of togetherness, and again, these podcasts for the next little while are going to be speaking about relationships and the idea of a self and then another self, the question becomes not how do you have the best deal in two selves coming together in a relationship. It's rather, how do we explore the dynamics of togetherness? And that to me becomes much more of an exciting, interesting question in relationships, because the question of togetherness starts to lead beyond aspects of our own sense of certainty, our own rigidity in terms of how we think things should or should not be, and it certainly starts to approach aspects of ourselves we may have split off and we may project. So I'll leave it there for this podcast, but thinking about this idea of splitting things off and projecting, and understanding that these are ways that we try and protect and help ourselves, and that we can have implicit responses, autonomic responses, that are based upon feelings of danger. If we're able to move from these spaces, these triggered states, and find our way to not only a more calm sense within ourselves, but also to move beyond the narrow tunnel of ourself, we may find that there's something beyond in this realm called togetherness, and that may open the door to something that is as yet unknown. So until next time, thanks a lot, and bye for now.